By day, the island is stunningly beautiful, but at night, everything changes. He is not alone. The island is home to violent, hostile creatures. Today, we're watching ColdSkin, a 2017 sci-fi horror film whose story is set in 1914. The film opens on a ship making its way through the South Atlantic Ocean toward its destination. On board is a weather officer named David. They are bound for an island concealed in the deepest part of the Atlantic. The government has sent David there to observe the island's changing weather patterns. He is to stay for about a year, collect data on the strange fluctuations in weather, and then return home. Captain Excel is bringing David to that island on his ship, along with a year's supply of food and all necessary equipment. After a long voyage, they finally arrive. They disembark by boat, carrying their supplies ashore. On the island stands a lighthouse and a small house where David will live, because another weather officer was stationed there before him. But that officer's term has ended. From today onward, David is the new weather officer of the island, and the previous officer, Robert, is set to return home on Captain Excel's ship. Yet upon entering the house, they are shocked. There is no sign of any person. Inside, furniture is scattered everywhere. Everything is in disarray. Perhaps someone might be inside the lighthouse. Without wasting a moment, Captain Excel and David hurry to the lighthouse, where they encounter a strange sight. The entire structure is besieged by sharp, jagged planks of wood, as if someone deliberately barricaded it shut so that no one could enter. Captain Excel and David knock repeatedly on the lighthouse gate, but receive no response. Finally, they shoved the gate open with great force and stepped inside. At the very top of the lighthouse, they found a man lying unconscious. His name was Gruner. When they asked Gruner about the previous weather officer, he replied dismissively, "He's dead. He caught some terrible disease." When the captain pressed him about the body, Gruner's answer was even more strange. Maybe someone killed him. Both David and the captain were taken aback by Gruner's words. They wondered if his mental state was unsound. Yet until they could locate the former officer, they could do nothing. The captain told David that if he wished, he could still return with them. But David knew that if he could deliver an accurate weather report on this island, the government would pay him handsomely, money he very much needed. So he decided to stay. The captain gave him a gun for protection, warning that this place might not be as safe as it seemed. After the captain's departure, David tidied up the house, making it livable. In one of the drawers, he discovered the old officer's diary. The previous officer had arrived on the island in 1913. The diary contained many notes about the island, but much of it was cryptic and incomplete. David read every line carefully. There were also strange sketches of unknown creatures. David couldn't fathom why they'd been drawn. Perhaps the officer, lonely, had doodled to pass the time. On one page was a photograph of the officer's wife. Reading the diary thoroughly tired David, and he dozed off. The next morning, David set out to work, but as soon as he reached the shoreline, he froze. Between the rocks, stones had been arranged in bizarre patterns with seashells interspersed among them. David thought perhaps Gruner had done this. Dismissing the thought, he resumed his weather observations. While scanning the lighthouse with his binoculars, he caught sight of another figure standing near Gruner, but he dismissed it as an illusion. Night fell, and David was busy at his instruments when there came a sudden knock at the door. Thinking it might be Gruner, David called out his name. No answer. Grasping his lamp, he stepped toward the door, but eerie sounds began to echo in his ears, and then he saw, slipping beneath the gate, a strange clawed hand reaching in. It was not human. Terror seized David's heart. He bolted for the basement and hid. Moments later, the mysterious creature had entered the house. It prowled through the rooms, searching for him. Through a narrow crack in the basement door, its terrible eyes peered in at David. He seized a knife, and as those eyes fixed on him, as soon as the creature's eye came close to the crack, David stabbed his knife through with all his strength. The creature screamed and fled, but it could return at any time. David shut the basement door tightly, tied it with rope, and spent the entire night there, wide awake, surrounded by fear. The next morning, when David stepped outside, he saw strange prints in the sand. They didn't resemble human footprints at all. It was clear this wasn't the work of a human. The prints led straight toward the ocean and vanished there. Now David understood everything. Why Gruner had surrounded the lighthouse with sharp wooden stakes. Perhaps it was because of that strange creature. And now, David realized this house was no longer safe. The creature might return that very night. Terrified, David ran toward the lighthouse, shouting to Gruner to open the gate and let him in. But Gruner refused, saying, "You should have left with the ship." Heartbroken, David returned, but he knew now he had to fortify his house. He boarded up every window with wood, surrounded the entire place with sharp stakes, and placed old papers and books outside the gate. Then he poured oil over them, so if the creature returned, he could scare it away with fire. But there was still one thing David didn't know, and he was going to find out tonight. By luck, he found an old box inside the house. Inside it was a gun and plenty of bullets. This gave him a bit of courage, but the fear hadn't gone. As the sun went down and night swallowed the island, David sat quietly in a corner of the house, gripping his gun. His breathing was fast and heavy. Then he heard a strange noise. As he stepped toward the window, the ground beneath his feet seemed to vanish. It wasn't just one. Multiple creatures were rising out of the water, the same bizarre beings. And all of them were heading straight for his house. In moments, they began trying to break down the gate. David immediately started shooting. Some creatures fell, but the rest became even more violent. They began trying to force their way into the house. As their numbers increased, David wasted no time and lit the papers and books he had left outside the gate. The flames scared the creatures, and one by one, they retreated back into the ocean. But now that same fire had reached David's house. The entire wooden structure caught fire, and the flames spread like lightning. Wrapping himself in a blanket, David broke through the gate and escaped, taking cover behind a large rock near the lighthouse. His right hand was badly burned. Luckily, it began to rain at that very moment. Slowly, the rain began to put out the fire. But even after a night-long downpour, by morning, David's home was gone, burned to ashes. Now, if David wanted to survive, he would have to go to the lighthouse. He had to take shelter. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks near the lighthouse. When Gruner came out of the lighthouse to fetch water, David quietly followed him, intending to hold him at gunpoint and force his way inside. But suddenly, just as Gruner pointed his own gun at David, a strange creature near Gruner attacked him. That creature was Gruner's protector. Gruner immediately stopped David and said, "It's my pet." David didn't fire, but he made a deal. If he was to stay alive, Gruner had to let him live in the lighthouse. David also pointed out he had enough gunpowder and food for both of them to survive a year. Gruner stayed silent for a moment, then reluctantly agreed. Before nightfall, they both went back to get the remaining supplies and returned to the lighthouse. The next morning, David woke up to find the creature quietly licking his burned hand while he slept. Within moments, his hand was much better. It was a shock for David, but what was happening before his eyes was hard to deny. At the top of the lighthouse, David saw Gruner counting the bullets they'd salvaged from the gun. That creature was also helping Gruner in its own way. It meant the creature wasn't violent by nature. David now wanted to know more about it and one day reveal it to the world because it was nothing short of a miracle. One strange female creature from the ocean's dark depths was right there with them. If the truth about her ever came out, David and Gruner could become world famous. But Gruner didn't want any of that. He had no one of his own. He didn't want to leave the island. According to him, in society, no one could live truly alone. Everyone had to be someone's servant or slave. For him, this island was perfect. A place where he could think of himself as a king, the master of his own will. That's why he'd even carved "Gruner is king" in several places around the island. But how had that strange female creature become his pet? It turned out Gruner had once saved her life. She'd gotten caught in his fishing net when she was small. From that day on, she'd stayed with Gruner and started obeying him. But Gruner was an angry, harsh man, and he never treated her with humanity. He maintained a regular physical relationship with her. Once she even attacked Gruner, and in retaliation, he punished her so severely that she began to see herself as his servant. Perhaps that was why every night those other creatures emerged from the ocean, trying to take her back. But those creatures couldn't attack in daylight. Either way, David no longer wanted to stay here. He wanted to send a signal to any passing ship so he could leave this place forever. The task was far from easy. Gruner insisted that no ship ever came near this island, but David didn't believe him. He felt more and more stifled here and desperately wanted to leave. As evening fell, Gruner warned him to be ready with his gun, since the creatures could attack at any moment. They prepared to switch on the lighthouse lamp, and soon a vast number of creatures rose from the sea and advanced toward the lighthouse. Gruner kept firing at them without pause, but David was frozen with fear and began to back away into the lighthouse. Repeatedly urged by Gruner to hold his ground, David did nothing and soon passed out. Gruner fought the creatures alone through the night. The next morning, furious, Gruner roused David and said, "If you want to stay in the lighthouse, you'll obey my every order. Fetch water daily, maintain the lighthouse, and stand guard with me at night, whether you like it or not." For David, it had become a matter of survival. Remain in the lighthouse or die. David agreed to every task, but one thing he could never stomach was Gruner's routine physical abuse of the female creature. Yet he understood that a man driven mad by years of isolation on a deserted island would lose his moral bearings. Still, he had no choice but to comply. Night fell again, and both prepared for guard duty. Once more, the creatures emerged, but this time, David did not flinch. He fired his gun. Gruner, however, did nothing. He shut David outside the gate and sat silently inside, determined that David learn for himself how to fight these beings or perish trying. David shouted for help, but Gruner offered none. By dawn, David had battled until exhaustion, sitting outside the gate, bloodied but alive. He had finally learned to face the creatures without fear. So the days passed, nights spent fighting, days spent doing Gruner's lighthouse chores, until the island felt like a prison. David constantly dreamed of escape and freedom. Over time, he and the female creature, whom he had named Anarius, grew strangely close. He realized how painful loneliness could be and suspected the creature felt the same. One day they noticed the nightly attacks were tapering off. David guessed the creatures might migrate in winter, like whales. Or perhaps they understood they could never prevail against him and Gruner. But Gruner insisted that they would return. The creatures were reproducing, and their numbers were growing. A few days later, after dinner, Gruner and David played chess to pass the time. But in their engrossment, they neglected to switch on the lighthouse lamps. Under cover of darkness, the creatures attacked. David saw that they had bred so prolifically that two men could not hold them off, and their ammunition was nearly spent. Fighting desperately, the two crawled to the top of the lighthouse, but in the struggle, Gruner suffered a serious leg wound. The creatures pressed in, and no escape was in sight. They resigned themselves to defeat, but morning came. As dawn broke, the creatures withdrew back into the sea. Anarius tended to Gruner's injury. Yet David now understood they could never win this fight. Their bullets were almost gone, and their food supplies wouldn't last much longer. The next day, fortunately, when David stepped outside the lighthouse, he was wandering around when he spotted a ship out at sea. He hurried inside for his flare gun and went to signal the vessel, but Gruner stopped him. He didn't want David to leave. At that moment, Anarius leapt at Gruner, trying to protect David. Gruner would let no one escape the island. This island was his own world, where he ruled like a king over a servant who obeyed his every command. He would not return to the city, and he would not let David go either. After all this time alone, he finally had someone to talk to. Slowly, the ship sank beneath David's eyes. There was nothing more he could do. A few more days passed the same way. Gruner continued to mistreat both David and Anarius, but especially Anarius, which David found unbearable. One day, David gave Anarius a small toy boat he had carved from whalebone, hoping it would cheer her up. But when Anarius saw the toy, she led David to a corner of the island where, tucked out of sight, an actual boat lay hidden. When David asked Gruner about it, Gruner admitted he already knew. A few months earlier, an arms smuggling ship heavy with munitions had gone down in a storm near this very spot. Some of the crew had made it ashore alive, but by morning, every one of them had fallen victim to the creatures. Hearing this, a plan formed in David's mind. They had something like a diving suit. If one of them donned it and went under the waves where the wreck lay, perhaps they could salvage bullets or even dynamite, making it easier to fight the monsters. But Gruner flatly refused. He wouldn't even set foot near that part of the sea. David, however, was willing to risk his life on the idea. Days more slipped by, and in that time, a deep bond grew between David and Anarius. He had come to care for her, and Gruner noticed. For the first time, he thought he might help David. Yet his true intention was darker. He would have David recover the underwater crates of dynamite, then abandon him to the monsters so that Gruner alone would possess the explosives. and Anarius would fall back into servitude. At last they came to the wreck's location. David put on the diving suit and plunged beneath the waves. The ship lay in ruin, but fortune favored them. They found several crates of dynamite. Then, to their horror, those creatures appeared. David panicked and slipped. The iron suit was so heavy he could not move, and he couldn't signal Gruner above. Gruner feared the creatures had killed David. In fact, the monsters were only two small children entangled in the wreckage. Beneath the surface, David used the water pressure to wrench free from the suit and swam up on his own. He found additional old crates of dynamite, which they brought ashore. Back on land, they arranged the dynamite in two concentric rings around the lighthouse, so that when the next attack came, the blast would wipe out the monsters and free them at last. They hoped to wipe them all out at once. Months passed and snow began to fall, but once again the creatures vanished and their attacks ceased. Now their main task was simply to keep the lighthouse running and stand guard as always. Gruner's patience finally snapped. He suspected Anarius had betrayed them by telling the creatures about the dynamite plan, hence their sudden disappearance. Enraged, he began beating Anarius, and David intervened to stop him. At last they agreed on a new plan. Leave the lighthouse's main gate wide open so that as soon as the creatures approached, they could detonate the dynamite. Before long, the creatures once more rose from the sea. They advanced straight toward the main gate, and as they poured in, they attacked David. Summoning his courage, David fought back, buying Gruner time to pull the lever, only to discover the blast failed. David had forgotten to reconnect the wires. He sprinted upward and began reattaching the detonator wires while the creatures clawed at the lighthouse walls, only Gruner holding them back single-handedly below. As soon as the connection was complete, David triggered the first ring of charges. Hundreds of creatures were obliterated, but many more still pressed in. So Gruner triggered the second ring, and a second massive explosion rocked the island. Both men were thrown unconscious. When they came to the next morning, Anarius was gone. The ground was littered with the fallen creatures. Gruner mercilessly finished off any survivors still writhing. Then David's eye caught something glinting on the neck of one dying creature, a necklace. In that moment, he realized his greatest mistake. These beings, whom he had assumed to be violent monsters, were civilized like humans, only voiceless. Their attacks must have had reasons he had never sought to understand. But to Gruner, such nuances were irrelevant. On this island, he was king, and all must obey his command. After that day, the creatures never attacked the lighthouse again. Yet each dawn, David heard a lone, weeping cry from the shore. He hadn't understood the scale of the tragedy he'd wrought, how many families were broken, how many children left parentless by a single misunderstanding. The next day, David noticed several small children of the creatures, their orphaned young, playing near the water's edge. He arranged a circle of stones and placed his little toy boat in its center, hoping to coax Anarius back. But no matter how long he waited, she did not return. One morning, David found Gruner unconscious inside the lighthouse, surrounded by old possessions, including a faded photograph. As he stared at it, his blood ran cold. The girl in the picture was the same woman whose portrait had adorned the diary on David's first day. She was not just any stranger, but Gruner's wife, and he had been previous weather officer, whose real name was Robert. He had changed his name after resigning himself never to leave the island. Upon learning the truth, David abandoned all hope of ever escaping this place. That evening, as he wandered the shore, he saw the toy boat was gone from the stone circle. In its place stood a small child of the creatures, holding the boat in its hands. David gently threw his torch into the center of the circle, signaling he meant no harm, only friendship. A moment later, Anarius emerged from the waves, followed by the entire group of creatures. But this time, none attacked. They too sought only a safe haven for their children, every living creature on the island. They hated the sudden arrival of humans on their island, and so they attacked every night. Gruner stormed out of the lighthouse, gun in hand. David tried to reason with him. These creatures don't want to fight, they want peace. But Gruner wouldn't listen. He shouted at Anarius, "Go inside." And for the first time she refused, because she was no longer a servant, but a mother standing up for her children. Gruner felt his power slipping. Enraged, he marched back toward the lighthouse. David thought perhaps he'd finally understood that every living being craves freedom. But Gruner was beyond reason. Raising his flare gun, he fired. and the flare struck one of the creature children, killing it instantly. Horrified, the creatures fled, and Anarius lost all trust in him. Driven mad with anger, David charged, tackling Gruner to the ground. "Why did you do this? They only wanted peace." Gruner, consumed by violence, raised his axe to kill David, until David called him by his true name, Robert. At that, Gruner froze. In reality, the man called Gruner had never been a murderer. Isolation, his wife's death, and a deep depression had shattered his mind. He had been a good man, and the creatures had never wanted to fight. They only reacted to his brutality. Realizing his horror, Robert surrendered himself to the creatures, and in moments, they ended his life. David locked himself inside the lighthouse. Time passed. A year later, a government officer arrived with a new weather observer. They assumed David was Gruner, and David said nothing to correct them. He simply stood on the balcony in silence, because, like Robert before him, he no longer wished to leave the island. Meanwhile, Anarius lived on with her family in peace. No longer hunted by a tyrant like Gruner, she and her people were finally free to roam both island and sea. The movie ends at that point. Although it was made in 2017 with a budget of $9 million, it didn't even earn $1 million at the box office.